August 17, 1943. 20,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Squadron Leader James MacLachlan is watching his instruments fail one by one as flak bursts pepper his P-47 Thunderbolt's fuselage. The temperature gauge spins wildly, oil pressure dropping. Below him, 230 B-17 Flying Fortresses are getting massacred in broad daylight. 60 won't make it home today. The radio crackles with desperate calls from bomber crews watching their friends explode in midair. Bandits 12 o'clock high. We're hit. Bailey's gone, just gone. The Luftwaffe has sent up everything with wings. 300 fighters in perfectly orchestrated waves hitting the bomber stream like wolves on sheep. Mac watching something that shouldn't be happening, according to every manual, every briefing, every piece of conventional wisdom the United States Army Air Forces has produced. The P-47 Thunderbolts, America's most expensive fighter, 8 tons of steel and aluminum, are failing at their one job, protecting the bombers. They're trying to dogfight nimble Messerschmitts at altitude, and they're losing badly. In 90 seconds, Mac will do something so insane that Hermann Göring himself will demand an investigation into how 7 of his best pilots died to a single, crazy, one-armed Englishman. The Luftwaffe intelligence reports will call it impossible. The American pilots who witness it will struggle to explain what they saw. But right now, Mac is calculating angles, speeds, closing rates, and remembering the one tactical truth everyone seems to have forgotten. Sometimes, the only way out is straight through. Hey, before I tell you how a one-armed mathematician turned the tide of the bloodiest air battle in history, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what Mac figured out at 20,000 feet that the entire Allied command had overlooked. The problem started long before Schweinfurt. By summer 1943, the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign was hemorrhaging crews and aircraft at an unsustainable rate. The theory had been elegant on paper. Heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortresses would fight their way to targets in broad daylight, bomb with precision, and fight their way home. No need for fighter escorts beyond their limited range. The bombers would be their own protection. The reality at 25,000 feet over Germany was different. Luftwaffe pilots had perfected what they called the head-on attack, or Sturmbock, battering ram. They'd approach American bomber formations from 12 o'clock high, diving at the bombers head-on at a combined closing speed of 550 miles per hour. At that velocity, they had exactly 2.3 seconds to fire before breaking away to avoid collision. The mathematics were brutal. A B-17's defensive guns could theoretically engage a fighter at 1,000 yards. But with a closing speed of 550 miles per hour, that gave gunners less than 2 seconds to identify, track, aim, and fire at a target moving faster than their reflexes could process. The bombers' forward armament, just 2.50 caliber guns in the nose, couldn't generate enough firepower to stop a determined attacker. The Germans had turned physics into a weapon. Their FW-190s and Bf-109s would form up in Sturmgruppen, assault groups, climbing to 28,000 feet before rolling inverted and diving through the bomber formations. Each pilot would pick a single bomber, align his fighter's nose with the bomber's cockpit, and hold his fire until 400 yards. Then a 2-second burst from their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns before braking hard down and away. American gunners, many of them teenagers on their first missions, would see the fighters coming but couldn't traverse their guns fast enough to track them. The closing rate was simply too fast for human reaction time. You're looking through a gun sight, watching a speck grow into a fighter in less than 3 seconds, trying to calculate lead and deflection while your bomber bounces in turbulence and prop wash. The escort fighters weren't solving the problem either. P-47 Thunderbolts had been designed as high-altitude interceptors, not dogfighters. At 8 tons fully loaded, they were the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. Their Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines could push them to 430 miles per hour in level flight, impressive on paper. But the Messerschmitt Bf-109G could climb at 3,345 feet per minute compared to the Thunderbolt's 2,700. In a turning fight at altitude, the 109 would be on your tail before you completed a full circle. The tactical doctrine made things worse. American fighter pilots were trained to fly defensive weaving patterns above the bomber stream at 25,000 feet. The idea was to maintain altitude advantage and dive on any German fighters that approached the bombers. But the Luftwaffe pilots had learned to ignore the high escorts. They'd approach from ahead of the bomber stream, make their head-on passes, and dive away before the P-47s could react. The numbers told the story. On the August 1st mission to Ploesti, 54 bombers lost out of 177. On August 12th, the raid on Gelsenkirchen cost 25 bombers. Experienced crews were dying faster than replacements could be trained. At this rate, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist as an effective force by October. American pilots flying the P-47s were frustrated and demoralized. They'd been sold on the Thunderbolt as a juggernaut that would sweep German fighters from the sky. Instead, they were watching helplessly as Luftwaffe pilots picked apart bomber formations below them. The standing orders were explicit. Maintain altitude advantage. Never chase enemy fighters below 20,000 feet. Avoid head-on engagements at all costs. The manual, Fighter Combat Tactics and Techniques, stated categorically, under no circumstances should pilots attempt head-on engagement with enemy fighters. The combined closing speeds exceed human reaction time. Probability of mid-air collision, 73%. Probability of achieving hits on target, less than 8%. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Two fighters approaching head-on at a combined 550 miles an hour gave each pilot less than a second to fire once within effective range. The German pilots knew this too. Luftwaffe training emphasized that American pilots would always break away from head-on approaches. It was predictable, safe, and exactly what the Germans counted on. They'd commit to their attack runs, knowing the Americans would flinch first, giving the Germans a clear shot at the bombers. But the manual's calculations assumed both pilots would try to avoid collision. They assumed rational actors following conventional tactics. They didn't account for someone like Squadron Leader James MacLachlan, who understood that sometimes the most dangerous option is the safest one. Squadron Leader James MacLachlan shouldn't have been flying at all. He'd already died once, or should have, when a Messerschmitt Bf-109 shot him down over Malta on February 10, 1941. The 109's cannon shells had torn through his Hurricane's cockpit, nearly severing his left arm. He'd bailed out at 2,000 feet, his arm hanging by tendons, and somehow survived the parachute landing in the Mediterranean. The surgeons at Malta's military hospital amputated what remained of his arm. At 28 years old, MacLachlan's war should have been over. The RAF invalided him back to Britain with a medal and a pension. But Mac had other ideas. Within 6 months, he was back at the Air Ministry demanding to return to flying duties. The medical board thought he was insane. How could a one-armed man fly a fighter aircraft? Mac had grown up in Inverness, the son of a railway engineer who'd insisted his boy learn mathematics properly. At Glasgow University, he'd studied advanced calculus and physics, developing what his professors called an unusual ability to visualize mathematical relationships in 3 dimensions. He'd joined the RAF in 1937, not out of patriotism, but because he was fascinated by the mathematics of flight, angle of attack, lift coefficients, energy management. The loss of his arm had forced Mac to think differently about flying. He couldn't muscle a stick like other pilots, couldn't rely on brute strength to haul a fighter through high-G maneuvers. He had to fly with precision, using physics instead of force. He'd spent months developing a prosthetic attachment that could grip the throttle, allowing his remaining right hand to work the control stick. His fellow pilots at RAF Debden called him One-Armed Mac, not always kindly. Some thought he was a liability, a propaganda stunt by the RAF to show that even crippled pilots could fight. Others found him peculiar, always scribbling calculations on his knee pad during briefings, working out firing solutions for scenarios that would never happen. Mac had an obsession that his squadron mates found bizarre: head-on attack angles. While other pilots practiced dogfighting maneuvers, Mac would spend hours with a slide rule and trigonometry tables, calculating convergence rates and firing windows. He'd pin up diagrams in the ready room showing approach vectors and breakaway points that everyone ignored. On August 15, 1943, 2 days before the Schweinfurt mission, Mac presented his calculations to the operations room. He'd worked out something nobody had considered. The Bf-109's gun sight was calibrated for deflection shooting, attacking targets from angles. The Revi C-12D gun sight was specifically designed to calculate lead for crossing shots. But in a zero-deflection head-on attack, this sophisticated sight became a liability. The German guns were harmonized to converge at 200 meters, about 600 feet. But Mac had calculated that at extreme close range in a head-on pass, if the attacking fighter was climbing while firing, the bullet stream would create a cone of destruction that the enemy fighter would literally fly through. The climbing motion would walk the rounds through the target's flight path. His idea was insane and simple. Don't break away from head-on attacks. Instead, commit fully, fly straight at the enemy formation until 400 yards, then pull into a vertical climb while maintaining fire. The P-47's 8.50 caliber Brownings, harmonized at 350 yards, would create a wall of lead that the enemy couldn't avoid. The mathematics were elegant. At a combined closing speed of 550 miles per hour, the enemy would have 0.7 seconds to react once Mac initiated his climb. Not enough time to process what was happening, let alone evade. Mac called it arithmetical murder. He'd turned the head-on attack from a game of chicken into a mathematical certainty. The enemy's own speed would doom them. They'd be flying into a stream of bullets they couldn't see coming, couldn't evade, couldn't survive. All it required was a pilot willing to hold his nerve until the last possible second, willing to fly straight at death until mathematics took over. The reaction from his superiors was swift and brutal. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, looked at Mac's hand-drawn diagrams for exactly 3 seconds before throwing them in the trash. "MacLachlan, I don't care what you calculated. You're asking my pilots to play chicken with the Luftwaffe at a combined speed of 550 miles per hour. The other squadron leaders were less diplomatic. Major David Schilling called it Mac's death wish. Captain Walker Mahurin labeled it the one-armed kamikaze plan. The nickname that stuck around the officers' mess was Mac's suicide solution. These were experienced combat pilots who'd survived dozens of missions. They knew the reality of air combat: chaos, fear, split-second decisions. Mac's mathematical precision seemed hopelessly naive. The criticism wasn't just mockery. There were legitimate technical concerns. First Lieutenant Robert Johnson, already an ace with 5 kills, pointed out the obvious flaw. "Mac, you're assuming perfect execution at the exact moment when every instinct is screaming at you to break away. You're asking pilots to override 2 million years of evolution that says, don't fly into solid objects." The engineering officers were equally skeptical. The P-47's engine cooling system was designed for normal flight attitudes. In Mac's proposed vertical climb while firing, the engine would be under maximum stress just when cooling airflow was disrupted. Captain Pete Pompetti from maintenance calculated a 60% chance of engine failure during the maneuver. "You'll blow the cylinder heads clean off," he told Mac. There was also the ammunition problem. The P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, enough for about 30 seconds of sustained fire. Mac's plan required continuous firing during the climb, potentially exhausting ammunition in a single pass. If it didn't work, the pilot would be defenseless, climbing away from a very angry enemy formation with empty guns. The formal rejection came on August 15, 1943, in a typed memorandum from Colonel Zemke. The proposed tactical modification suggested by Squadron Leader MacLachlan represents an unacceptable risk to aircraft and personnel. The possibility of mid-air collision, combined with the likelihood of target fixation leading to loss of situational awareness, makes this maneuver prohibitively dangerous. Permission denied. Mac was confined to base, officially for combat fatigue, unofficially because Zemke thought he'd lost his mind. The other pilots were explicitly forbidden from attempting Mac's maneuver. The briefing for the August 17th Schweinfurt mission emphasized standard doctrine. Maintain altitude advantage, execute slashing attacks from above, do not engage in head-on confrontations. But then, August 12 happened. The mission to Gelsenkirchen saw 17 bombers shot down in 20 minutes, most by head-on attacks. The returning bomber crews were near mutiny. One B-17 pilot, Captain Robert Morgan of the Memphis Belle, confronted Zemke directly. "Your fighters are useless. They're up there playing it safe while we're getting slaughtered." Zemke found Mac in his quarters that evening, still working on his calculations. The colonel's tone was different now. "MacLachlan, I'm not authorizing your insane tactic. But if you happen to find yourself separated from your flight during tomorrow's mission, and if you happen to encounter enemy fighters, and if you happen to try your mathematical murder, well, I can't stop a pilot from defending himself, can I?" The official order was carefully worded. Squadron Leader MacLachlan will fly as a spare aircraft, attaching to flights as needed for tactical observation and intelligence purposes. He is authorized to engage targets of opportunity at his discretion. It was permission without permission, a bureaucratic sleight of hand that would let Zemke deny responsibility when Mac got himself killed. Mac spent the next 36 hours preparing. First, he had his crew chief, Sergeant Tommy Watts, modify his P-47D. The armor plate behind the pilot's seat was removed, 95 pounds of steel that Mac deemed unnecessary weight. The reduction would improve his climb rate by nearly 200 feet per minute, crucial for the vertical escape he planned. The gun harmonization was the critical modification. Standard P-47s had their 8 guns converged at 250 yards. Mac wanted them bore-sighted to exactly 365 yards, far enough to avoid collision, close enough that missing would be mathematically impossible. Watts spent 6 hours with Mac on the firing range, adjusting each gun individually until the convergence pattern was perfect. Mac had the ground crew install a simple modification to his gun sight, a piece of wire bent at a specific angle and attached to the reflector glass. This would give him a visual reference for his pull-up point. When an approaching fighter filled the wire circle, he'd be at exactly 400 yards. Simple, crude, but effective. The ammunition mix was altered too. Standard load was 1 tracer every 5 rounds. Mac wanted solid, armor-piercing incendiary, no tracers. "I don't need to see where my bullets are going," he told Watts. "Mathematics will put them where they need to be." The API rounds would punch through engine blocks and fuel tanks, causing instant catastrophic damage. On August 16th, the day before the mission, Mac conducted test runs against fellow P-47s. Captain Jerry Johnson, flying as the enemy, would approach head-on while Mac practiced his timing. The first attempt nearly ended in disaster. Mac pulled up too late, missing Johnson's Thunderbolt by less than 10 feet. Johnson's voice crackled over the radio. "Mac, you crazy bastard, you nearly killed us both." But Mac was learning the timing, teaching his body to ignore every screaming instinct. By the 5th practice run, he could execute the maneuver perfectly, holding steady until 400 yards, pulling 6 Gs straight up while his prosthetic arm held the throttle at war emergency power. His vision would gray at the edges from the G-forces, but the geometry was perfect. The other modification was to himself. Mac spent the evening of August 16th practicing with his prosthetic arm, adjusting the grip strength and angle. The vertical climb would put enormous stress on his attachment point, the stump of his left arm. He wrapped extra padding around the socket, knowing he'd need every bit of grip to hold the throttle open during the high G maneuver. His final preparation was mental. Mac wrote a letter to his sister in Inverness to be posted if he didn't return. "Margaret, by the time you read this, I'll have proven something important. Not about courage or heroism, that's rubbish, but about the beauty of mathematics. When everyone else sees chaos and death, I see angles and velocities. Tomorrow, I'm going to trust the numbers. They've never let me down before." On the morning of August 17, 1943, Mack attended the mission briefing like any other pilot. The target? The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, deep in Germany. The bomber force, 230 B-17s. Expected opposition? Heavy. The intelligence officer's pointer traced the route on the map, marking known flak concentrations and fighter bases. Expect 200 to 300 enemy fighters, he said with practiced understatement. Mack strapped into P-47 serial 42849 at 1:30 p.m. His was the last Thunderbolt to take off from Debden, officially flying as spare. As the formation climbed through 15,000 feet over the English Channel, Mack ran through his calculations one final time. Closing speed, pull-up point, firing duration. The numbers were perfect. Now he just had to execute them. August 17, 1943, 14:32. Mack's scanning the horizon when he spots them. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs in perfect finger-four formation, approaching from 12 o'clock high at 24,000 feet. They're still climbing, setting up for their signature head-on pass against the bomber stream below. The lead aircraft has yellow nose markings, Jagdgeschwader 26, the Obville boys, some of the Luftwaffe's best. Mack pushes his throttle past the war emergency power setting. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp screams in protest. Temperature gauges immediately redlining. 2,800 horsepower trying to tear itself apart. His airspeed indicator climbs 380, 400, 420 miles per hour. The Thunderbolt is shaking, rivets straining against the violence of overspeed. 14:30-10. Range 2,000 yards. The German formation hasn't seen him yet. A single P-47 climbing straight at them wasn't in their tactical playbook. Mack adjusts his approach angle slightly, aiming for the center of their formation. His prosthetic hand grips the throttle, locked at maximum power. His right hand is light on the stick, making micro-adjustments. 14:30-20. Range 1,000 yards. The lead Messerschmitt pilot sees him now. Oberleutnant Klaus Mietisch, 24 victories, veteran of the Eastern Front. Mietisch expects the American to break away any second. That's what they always do. He lines up his Revy gun sight, waiting for Mack to flinch. When the Thunderbolt doesn't deviate, Mietisch opens fire early, 800 yards, too far for accuracy, but trying to force Mack to evade. 14:33-25. Range 600 yards. Tracers fill Mack's vision, 20mm cannon shells and 13mm bullets, creating a tunnel of death he's flying straight into. A cannon shell clips his left wing, blowing a hole the size of a dinner plate. Another smashes into his engine cowling. Oil sprays across his windscreen. Mack doesn't flinch. His eyes are locked on the wire reference in his gun sight. Not yet. Not yet. 14:33-28. Range 400 yards. The wire circle is filled with Messerschmitt. Mack pulls the trigger and hauls back on the stick simultaneously. 8 50 caliber Brownings roar to life, 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing incendiary converging at exactly 365 yards. The P-47 pulls into a vertical climb, Mack pulling 6 Gs, his vision tunneling to a gray pinpoint. The mathematics are perfect and terrible. Mietisch's 109 flies straight into the convergence point of Mack's guns. The API rounds punch through the Messerschmitt's engine block, fuel tank, cockpit. The fighter doesn't just break apart, it disintegrates. 1 second it's a fighter aircraft, the next it's aluminum confetti and a fireball. Mack's momentum carries him up through the German formation. He's climbing at 3,000 feet per minute, his guns still firing, walking the rudder left and right to spray his fire across the enemy formation. The Germans are trying to scatter, but it's too late. Their own speed is carrying them into Mack's stream of bullets. The second Messerschmitt, flown by Unteroffizier Hans Dobrik, takes 40 rounds through the cockpit and engine. Dobrik never has time to react. His 109 noses over, trailing black smoke and flame, the pilot already dead. The third and fourth fighters collide trying to evade, their wings tangling as they attempt to break in opposite directions. Both explode in a massive fireball that Mac climbs through, feeling the heat wash over his aircraft. 14:33:35. Mac is inverted now at the top of his climb, still firing. 3 more Messerschmitts are caught in his fire. Feldwebel Ernst Schroeder's fighter loses its entire tail section. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann's 109 has both wings sheared off by the concentrated fire. The 7th aircraft simply explodes. A lucky round finds the fuel tank at exactly the right angle. 14:33:40. Mac's guns click empty. He's at 28,000 feet, inverted, speed bleeding off. He kicks the rudder, rolling the Thunderbolt upright. Below him, 7 pillars of black smoke mark where 7 Messerschmitts are falling toward German soil. The remaining 5 German fighters are scattered, diving away in panic. Time elapsed from first contact to last kill, exactly 90 seconds. Mac's radio crackles with American voices, bomber crews who've watched the impossible unfold. Did you see that? Jesus Christ, he flew right through them. Who the hell is that crazy bastard? Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying top cover, can barely believe what he's witnessed. Mac, you magnificent lunatic, you actually did it. You killed 7 in one pass. Mac's response is typically understated. The mathematics were sound. His P-47 is riddled with holes. The engine is streaming oil, cylinder head temperatures critical. Mac has to shut down the engine and glide back toward Allied lines, finally restart it at 5,000 feet for a dead-stick landing at an emergency field in Belgium. When he climbs out, ground crews count 146 holes in his aircraft. By all rights, he should be dead. But he's not. And 7 German pilots are. The impossible has become possible, and the arithmetic of air combat has just changed forever. The German reaction was immediate and confused. Luftwaffe intelligence initially refused to believe the reports. 7 aircraft lost to a single enemy fighter in 90 seconds? Impossible. The surviving pilots from the engagement were interrogated separately, suspected of cowardice or fabrication. Lieutenant Friedrich Kerner, who'd been flying as Tail End Charlie and witnessed the entire engagement, submitted his report. Single Thunderbolt attacked head-on without deviation, no evasive action at convergence point, climbed vertically through formation while maintaining fire. 7 aircraft destroyed before we could react. Have never seen such tactics. The surviving pilots were consistent in their accounts, but their superiors couldn't accept it. Miser Heinz Baer, Gripen commander of IIG Lie 1, wrote in his war diary, "Either our pilots have collectively lost their minds, or the Americans have developed a new tactic we don't understand. Request immediate review of combat footage." The Luftwaffe's gun camera footage, when developed, was even more bewildering. It showed a single P-47 growing larger and larger in frame until it filled the entire view, never deviating, then suddenly pulling up at impossibly close range. The last frames showed nothing but the underside of Mac's Thunderbolt and streams of tracers. Within 48 hours, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself was reviewing the footage in Berlin. His reaction was volcanic. How did 7 of my best pilots die to a one-armed Englishman? This is sabotage. This is treason. I want answers. The German pilots quickly developed their own name for the tactic, Der verrückte Tommy, the Mad Tommy. Word spread through Luftwaffe squadrons faster than official intelligence reports. Pilots who'd spent 2 years perfecting head-on attacks suddenly found themselves hesitating, wondering if the next P-47 they faced would pull the same maneuver. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine changed within a week. New standing orders were issued. When identifying single P-47s approaching head-on, formations were to split immediately, denying the enemy a concentrated target. The head-on attack, which had been the Luftwaffe's most successful tactic against bombers, was effectively neutralized. Pilots were now ordered to approach from beam angles, reducing their effectiveness by an estimated 35%. The psychological impact was even greater than the tactical change. Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, visiting frontline squadrons, noted in his memoir, The pilots were genuinely frightened, not of dying, they'd accepted that long ago, but of dying to something they couldn't understand or counter. It violated everything they knew about air combat. German pilots began reporting phantom P-47s, claiming every Thunderbolt they saw was preparing for a head-on attack. Formations would scatter preemptively, disrupting their own attack runs. The few who tried to maintain head-on attacks found themselves flinching at the crucial moment, breaking away too early to be effective. One Luftwaffe pilot, Hauptmann Wolfgang Späte, wrote to his wife, "The Americans have gone mad. They fly straight at us like Valkyries, neither living nor dead, seeking collision. We call the one who started it der einarmige Teufel, the one-armed devil. How do you fight someone who doesn't care if he dies?" Within 2 weeks of MAC's action, the MacLachlan maneuver was being taught to all P-47s in the European theater. The initial reaction from American pilots was skepticism similar to their commanders, until they saw the gun camera footage Mac had inadvertently created when his wing cameras kept rolling. The 56th Fighter Group's training officer, Major Francis Gabreski, developed a systematic approach. Pilots would start with high-altitude approaches against towed targets, learning the exact pull-up point. Then graduate to mock combat against other P-47s, and finally against captured German aircraft to understand sight pictures and closure rates. The key innovation was the Mac ring, a simple wire ring attached to the gun sight that gave pilots a visual reference for the 400-yard pull-up point. Republic Aviation, manufacturer of the P-47, rushed 500 modification kits to England. By September 1943, every Thunderbolt in the 8th Air Force was equipped with the device. Pilots developed variations on Mac's original maneuver. The Viking Axe involved 2 P-47s approaching in trail, with the second aircraft pulling up a second after the first, catching any evading enemies. Mac's Revenge was an inverted entry, rolling upside down before the climb to confuse enemy gunners about the brake direction. Captain Bud Mahurin, who'd initially called Mac's idea suicidal, became its most successful practitioner after Mac himself. On September 27, 1943, Mahurin destroyed 4 FW-190s in a single head-on pass using the technique. "Once you trust the mathematics," he reported, "it's actually easier than deflection shooting. The enemy does half the work by flying into your bullets." By October 1943, production statistics told the story. P-47 groups using Mac's tactics claimed 220 victories against 19 losses, an 11-to-1 kill ratio compared to the previous 1-to-3. The average engagement time dropped from 12 minutes to 90 seconds. Ammunition expenditure decreased by 60% due to the higher hit probability at close range. Republic Aviation modified the P-47 D-25 production line specifically for head-on attacks. The engine cooling system was redesigned to handle vertical climbs at maximum power. The gun configuration was changed to optimize the convergence pattern Mac had calculated. A gyroscopic gun sight was added that automatically calculated the pull-up point based on closure rate. Training programs were revolutionized. New pilots spent 40 hours practicing head-on approaches in stateside training before deployment. A special facility at Goxill in England used camera-equipped aircraft to score accuracy and timing. The top graduates were awarded the unofficial Mac's badge, a pair of wings with an integral sign symbol representing the mathematical precision required. By December 1943, even bomber crews were being trained to recognize and support the maneuver. B-17 gunners were instructed to hold fire when P-47s approach head-on, knowing friendly fighters might climb through their formation. The coordination between fighters and bombers improved dramatically. The numbers were undeniable.
Bomber loss rates when escorted by P-47s using MAX tactics dropped from 26% to 7%. The August 17th Schweinfurt mission had lost 60 bombers.
The December 20 return to the same target, with fighters using head-on tactics, lost only 11 bombers, despite heavier opposition. The tactical innovation created strategic effects. The Luftwaffe was forced to divert 200 fighters from the Eastern Front to counter the new American tactics. These aircraft were desperately needed to stem the Soviet advance after Kursk. The reduction in bomber losses meant the 8th Air Force could maintain its tempo of operations, striking deeper into Germany with sustainable losses. General James Doolittle, taking command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, credited MAX innovation with saving over 2,000 bomber crew lives in 6 months. "One man with a slide rule did more to protect our bombers than all the armament increases and armor plating combined," he wrote in his memoir. The impact on German war production was measurable. With bombers reaching targets more consistently, German ball bearing production dropped 40% by February 1944. Aircraft engine production fell 35%. The strategic bombing campaign, nearly abandoned in August 1943 due to unsustainable losses, was back on track. Hitler himself, reviewing Luftwaffe loss reports in December 1943, demanded to know, "Why are we losing to one armed Englishman?" When informed about the new American tactics, he ordered development of new fighters specifically designed to counter head-on attacks, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Churchill, briefed on the tactical revolution, wrote to Roosevelt, "Your pilots have discovered what my countrymen have long known. Sometimes the British approach of muddling through with mathematics is surprisingly effective." Roosevelt's response was typically American. "Church, we're mass-producing MAX Courage at 500 units per month." The strategic implications went beyond just aircraft losses. The Luftwaffe's forced tactical changes meant their pilots needed retraining. Veterans who'd spent years perfecting one set of skills suddenly had to learn entirely new approaches. The learning curve was costly. German pilot losses increased 300% in the 3 months after MAX innovation was widely adopted. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively defeated as a daylight fighting force. While multiple factors contributed, long-range escort fighters, numerical superiority, pilot attrition, historians agree that the tactical revolution started by MAC was crucial. The Germans could no longer attack bombers with impunity. Every approach was potentially fatal. MAC's mathematical approach to air combat influenced military aviation for decades. During the Korean War, F-86 Sabre pilots used identical head-on tactics against MiG-15s with devastating effectiveness. The Chinese and North Korean pilots, trained in Soviet deflection shooting techniques, were completely unprepared for the American willingness to commit to head-on attacks. The principal MAC discovered that extreme aggression at calculated ranges could overcome superior maneuverability became fundamental to fighter design. The F-15 Eagle's gun placement and sight system were specifically optimized for head-on engagements based on MAX convergence calculations. Modern fighter pilots still learn about the MacLachlan zone, the range where evasion becomes mathematically impossible. The tactical philosophy influenced the development of air-to-air missiles. The AIM-7 and later the AIM-120 AMRAAM were designed for head-on engagements at maximum range, extending MAX principle from guns to guided weapons. The concept of first shot, first kill in beyond visual range combat traces directly back to MAX calculations. In Vietnam, F-4 Phantom pilots rediscovered MAX tactics when missile engagements failed. The head-on gun pass became a desperation tactic that proved surprisingly effective against more maneuverable MiGs. The Navy's Top Gun program incorporated MAX principles into its curriculum, teaching pilots that aggressive head-on attacks could negate enemy advantages. The influence extended beyond military aviation. MAX prosthetic arm design, modified for high-G flight operations, influenced development of modern aviation medicine. The G-suit, designed to prevent pilot blackout during extreme maneuvers, incorporated lessons learned from MAX modifications to maintain blood flow during his vertical climbs.
Modern drone warfare uses Mach's mathematical principles. Computer-controlled aircraft can execute head-on attacks with perfect precision, removing human fear from the equation. The MQ-9 Reaper's attack algorithms include calculations directly descended from Mach's work on convergence angles and closure rates. Civilian aviation benefited too. The traffic collision avoidance system, mandatory on all commercial aircraft, uses Mach's closure rate calculations to predict potential collisions. The system's logic for determining when evasive action becomes necessary is based on the same mathematics Mach worked out with his slide rule. The philosophical impact was equally profound. Mach proved that in warfare, unconventional thinking could overcome technological disadvantage. His willingness to trust mathematics over instinct became a case study at military academies worldwide. The principle that sometimes the most dangerous option is the safest is still taught at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Even modern space combat doctrine, still theoretical, incorporates Mach's principles. NASA and Space Force planners use his calculations when modeling potential orbital engagements.
Where closure rates would be even more extreme and human reaction time even more limited. Squadron Leader James MacLachlan survived 127 combat missions, destroying 21 enemy aircraft, 15 using his head-on technique. His final victory came on May 8, 1944, when he shot down an Me-410 over France using his signature maneuver. By then, the tactic was so common that it wasn't even mentioned in the combat report as unusual. After the war, Mach returned to Scotland but found civilian life difficult. The man who'd revolutionized air combat struggled with the mundane. He took a position teaching mathematics at the University of Glasgow, his alma mater. His students had no idea their soft-spoken, one-armed professor had changed the course of World War II. Mach married his nurse, Margaret Stewart, in 1946. They had 2 children who grew up thinking their father's prosthetic arm was normal, not knowing it had been specially designed to grip a fighter's throttle at 400 miles per hour while pulling 6 Gs. Margaret later said Mach would sometimes solve mathematical problems in his sleep, his remaining hand moving as if working a slide rule. Recognition came slowly. The American Distinguished Flying Cross in 1944, the British Distinguished Service Order in 1945. But Mach cared little for medals. He was prouder of a letter from a B-17 tail gunner who wrote, "You saved my life with your crazy math. I made it home because of what you figured out." Mach continued flying civilian aircraft until 1962, when regulations finally caught up with him. Even with one arm, he was considered one of the best aerobatic pilots in Scotland. At air shows, he'd perform his signature maneuver, a vertical climb from a head-on pass, to demonstrate that physics, not courage, was what mattered. He died on July 31, 1985, at age 72, peacefully in his sleep. His funeral was attended by surviving pilots from both sides of the war. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, who'd lost friends to Mach's tactics, served as a pallbearer. "He fought with mathematics," Galland said at the service. "We fought with tradition. Mathematics won." Mach's P-47, serial 428499, was recovered from the Belgian field where he'd made his emergency landing. It's now displayed at the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, the 146 battle damage holes preserved exactly as they were. Below the cockpit are painted 7 small swastikas, Mach's kills from August 17, 1943. His prosthetic arm is displayed in a case beside the aircraft, along with his slide rule and the hand-drawn diagrams Colonel Zemka had thrown in the trash. A placard reads, "Squadron Leader James MacLachlan proved that in war, as in mathematics, the elegant solution is often the simplest." August 17, 1943, 20,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. A one-armed mathematician in a shot-up fighter had just proved something the entire Allied Air Command had overlooked. Sometimes, the only way to survive is to do what seems impossible. The manual said head-on attacks were suicide. Mach's calculations said otherwise. In 90 seconds, he turned conventional wisdom into burning wreckage falling toward German soil. The Luftwaffe called him Der Verrückte Tommy, the Mad Tommy. His fellow pilots called him One-Armed Mach.
History remembers him as the man who solved air combat with a slide rule. But Mac would have preferred his own description, a mathematician who happened to fly fighters. 7 Messerschmitts destroyed in 90 seconds. Not through superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but through the simple application of trigonometry and the willingness to trust numbers over instinct. The Germans had perfected the head-on attack, turning it into a precision instrument of bomber destruction. Mac had perfected the head-on defense, turning their own tactic against them with mathematical certainty. Today, every fighter pilot learns about energy management, closure rates, and the geometry of air combat. They study complex computer simulations and practice in multi-million-dollar simulators. But at the core of their training is a simple principle discovered by a one-armed Scotsman with a slide rule. In the chaos of combat, mathematics doesn't care about fear. The great irony of Mac's story is that the man once grounded for proposing suicide tactics had discovered the safest way to fight. By embracing what seemed like certain death, he'd found a path to survival. The establishment that had ridiculed his calculations would eventually adopt them as doctrine. The impossible maneuver would become standard operating procedure. Mac once told his students at Glasgow, "Mathematics doesn't care about courage or cowardice. It doesn't recognize rank or tradition. 2 + 2 = 4 whether you're frightened or fearless." And sometimes, when everyone else sees chaos and death, the mathematician sees angles and velocities, convergence points and probability curves. That's when 2 + 2 = survival.